The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to mention at the outset I'll be splitting my time with the member for Vancouver East, and then say that I'm pleased to rise to what I think is a very timely motion addressing an issue that's been preoccupying this place now for a number of weeks, particularly surrounding the nomination of Madame Mayor to the post of Official Languages Commissioner. That was an example of just partisanship gone completely amok, Mr. Speaker. We've heard from members on the other side of the House saying, you know, there's always, it's not quite clear what the line of argument is in terms of its justification. Sometimes it sounds as if they're saying there's always been partisan appointments, so it's okay, get over it. We're all just supposed to pretend that that's okay. Then there's other lines of argument that say, perhaps slightly more compellingly, that people shouldn't be penalized for their public service in the past. And I think it is the case that people who have served publicly and in partisan roles in the past can occupy some posts. Not independent officers of Parliament, though. There's a much higher threshold. And I think it's still expected. You know, partisan appointments where people just simply aren't qualified for the job are not okay at any time, Mr. Speaker. And sometimes it may be that someone served in a partisan role before, but they're qualified for a particular position. They've demonstrated that they can act in nonpartisan ways, and that may be acceptable for some positions. There's a lot of different positions that governments appoint to. But to pretend that someone that partisan, who's still actively partisan, who used partisan connections to be nominated for a post, and that post is not just any of those government appointments, but is meant to serve not the government, but Parliament as an independent officer, is too much. And that's why that nomination, above many others, because this government has made many appointments, and some of them have been Liberal partisans that have been appointed to those positions, and those appointments have not preoccupied the House for weeks at a time. That one was particularly offensive because of the extent of the partisanship and the particular role that that person was being nominated to serve, Mr. Speaker. And this motion tries to ensure that for those roles that are for positions that are meant to serve Parliament independently and not the government in its mandate, that there be an appointment process that meaningfully consults the opposition. Now, that's in the legislation for the Official Languages Commissioner, that there be consultation, but there's no mechanism specified that gives meaning to that consultation, and we saw that, and we know from testimony by the House leaders of the two recognized official opposition parties and their leaders that they weren't consulted, that they got a letter saying this is a fait accompli, just thought you might like to know, and we're moving on. Now, that was problematic because I don't think that that's what was intended by the legislation in the first place, so there's a question of the spirit of the law. But it also was problematic because it didn't even, because at the end of the day, it didn't work, Mr. Speaker, because the provisions in that legislation that say the opposition parties have to be consulted in order to appoint independent officers of Parliament isn't just about some letter of the law. It's about garnering the appropriate moral authority for the appointment that the government wants to make so that that person can be seen by all parties in this place as someone that can be respected in their role and independent in their role. And what that consultation provision means, Mr. Speaker, is that it's incumbent on the government to come up with a nominee that receives the approval of those other parties so that that person can perform their role. And in the absence of that approval by opposition parties, that person will not be able to fulfill their role. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what the events of the last week or so have shown us, they may not even be able to be successfully appointed to that role, because any potential nominee with any integrity and credibility would know that by the time their nomination process blew up that badly and the opposition parties were that opposed to their appointment to that position, that they wouldn't be able to do their job effectively. And if they cared a whit about the office that they were nominated to be appointed to, and if they cared a whit about the function that they would be asked to perform in that office, they would have to withdraw. And it's a shame on the government that the nominee had to make that call because the government was either too blind or too partisan to see it, Mr. Speaker. So congratulations finally to Madame Mayor for having seen that she was never going to be able to do the job that she was being asked to do, and shame on the government for not realizing that fact itself and for pressing on for whatever reasons it had, still unclear, and insisting that someone who clearly would not be able to perform the role of an independent officer of Parliament be appointed to that role anyway, Mr. Speaker. And it's surprising to me, frankly, that a lot of people who got elected under the Liberal banner of change and transparency and accountability, and many who I think didn't know Madame Mayor or had any idea of her existence, would be willing to put their privilege of representing their constituents on the line in the next election to defend the PMO's attachment to Madame Mayor. I mean, that's what's been interesting for me to watch, is the extent to which Liberal backbenchers were willing to rally around a person they didn't know simply because she had a personal relationship with Gerald Butts. That's, I think, quite unfortunate, and I think speaks volumes to the extent to which those Liberals really need to come around to the responsibility of their own office. And what we're trying to do with this motion is provide for them a way of doing that, because their own government refuses to do so. And I think it would be a good idea for them to rally behind this kind of motion that would help take the politics out of these kinds of appointments by ensuring that the meaningful consultation already foreseen in some of the legislation for some of these positions is actually given teeth, and that you actually have opposition agreement before those nominations go forward. That would make life easier for them, because then they wouldn't be putting their political credibility on the line for the sake of the personal relationships of staff in the PMO. If I were in government, I would certainly appreciate not having to do that, and I would certainly be uncomfortable having to do that. And they've been doing that very publicly for weeks, and are only now not doing it to the extent that they aren't, because Madame Mayor herself had the wherewithal finally to withdraw her own nomination. So I recommend this to them as a way to solve a problem that their government is creating for them at home in their own ridings, whether they realize it or not. It's a similar problem they created when they invented the cash for access schemes, or they didn't invent them, they borrowed them from the Win Liberals in Ontario. But when they decided to import that practice here and grant preferential access to government for, in exchange for high-priced tickets to fundraisers, that was, again, something they did that I'm sure many of the Liberal backbenchers didn't foresee and didn't think they were coming to Ottawa to defend. That isn't necessary in order to be able to ensure the survival of the Liberal Party and make sure they have coffers. They have a lot of potential to go out and get legitimate donations and not sell access to ministers in order to raise money. So why it is that many of the Liberals on the backbench are willing all of a sudden to get behind that and call that an acceptable practice, I don't know. So what we're trying to do is offer them an out for at least one of their problems. And what we've heard today is that they're not interested in taking that out. Why? Well, I don't know. If the committee accepts the nomination of the government, so first of all, the government has the power of nomination, which is a considerable power. The only people that will be discussed for these positions are people that are in the first place put forward by government. That's a significant influence that the government has on the process. So this is hardly throwing up your hands and leaving it up to opposition parties to decide who's going to be in these positions. Secondly, if the committee accepts the government recommendation, there's the opportunity for Parliament to affirm that with a vote or reject it with a vote. And then the idea behind a rejection of that nomination not coming to Parliament is simply to show that it's incumbent upon the government to work well enough with the opposition parties in advance to find someone that all those parties can actually agree on. And it's not consensus at the committee either, Mr. Speaker. So whether there's 3, 4, or 5 recognized parties, it's a committee. It's a subcommittee. They have to vote on it. Even if a majority of the government and opposition parties agree on a candidate, that will go forward and there will be a vote. And presumably the party or parties that didn't agree will get to express that in the House. That's the point of the vote. So this doesn't require unanimity between the government and the opposition parties. All it says is that the government has to work with at least enough opposition parties that some other party agrees with them. That's not a high threshold, Mr. Speaker. But it's better than what we have now, where we've got a House leader that's going to be determining, because the Prime Minister has recused himself from naming the next conflict of interest commissioner, as if that was a high watermark for integrity, and then handed it over to the very person who defends him every day in the House when we talk about his ethical lapses, Mr. Speaker. But I digress. Suffice it to say, this would be a much better system than what we have now and a step in the right direction. I hope at least the Liberal backbench sees fit to support it.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for... Sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Sarnia Lambton. That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague. It's too bad there's not even a quorum in here to hear from the government side this great and important motion that his party's brought forward today. One of the things that troubles me the most about this whole partisan appointment thing is the lack of openness and transparency that we've seen through this whole thing. I mean, from the Heritage Minister contradicting testimony from Madam Mayor, contradicting what the opposition parties have said about not being consulted, the evasion of answering any of the questions that we brought to this. And so openness and transparency is fundamental to making sure we have a nonpartisan, independent oversight. And I wonder if the member could elaborate on how the recommended new process would make things more open and transparent to Canadians.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I mean, I think part of the trick, if you will, of having a truly transparent and open process is involving the other parties concerned in a meaningful way, so that in their decision making they have the information that they would need, and I think this is foreseen by that there's an appropriate forum for real discussion, so that when there is disputes, it's not just, well, we sent you a letter and you got the information, and if you don't like it, what are your options then? To raise it in question period, to raise it in supply day motions, to take it to the media. But that's not, at that point, a real consultative process. That's now an airing of grievances about a process gone wrong. And so by establishing a subcommittee, creating a forum for discussion, providing the information that people from all parties would need in order to be able to assess the qualifications and the independence of these folks, because I would remind the House again, this is about appointing independent officers of Parliament, people in positions meant to serve all of Parliament, not implement the mandate of government. And that's an important difference. So I do think that this proposal in its very nature will lend itself far more to openness and transparency, something we've yet to see.
Comments? The honourable member for Edmonton-Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his comments. Mr. Speaker, what is really critical here is our motion here today deals with simply the officers of Parliament. Now, I'm concerned as well with all appointments because pro forma, other appointments are being referred to committee. But with the majority Liberal government, I don't think so far my committee we reviewed a single appointment, which is what we are supposed to be doing as parliamentarians. But Mr. Speaker, the question I wish to put my colleague is this. We're talking about officers of Parliament, which include the Auditor General, and then when the government finally, under pressure, agreeing to make the Parliamentary Budget Officer also an officer of Parliament. These are officers who advise everyone in this House. Every member of Parliament is accountable for holding the government accountable for spending, including all of the Liberal members. And so, does the member not agree that it is absolutely critical that we have independent, qualified analysis so that we can deliver one of our most critical roles, which is to hold the government accountable on spending?
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, thank you to my colleague for the question. Of course, the short answer is yes, it is important. But I would say that part of an important aspect of that independence and getting that independent advice, aside from the person's qualifications, aside from whatever their political background is, preferably less as opposed to more, when we're talking about an independent officer of Parliament, is also the trust of parliamentarians on all sides of the House. Because that's someone that you're going to be you're going to be, in some cases, providing them information about what you're doing or what you're thinking that you want to have remain confidential. You want to know that you're getting objective advice that isn't designed from the outset to protect a particular party, in this case the governing party, and in most cases it's going to be the governing party because they control that appointment, or at least that's how it is right now. So what's foreseen in this motion is an attempt not just to get the best qualified candidate, although that's important, and not just to assure their independence in the sense of, seeing what their background was and whether it's credible to think they can act independently. The point of that is so that all members of this House, regardless of what side they sit on, can trust that officer with the information that they're going to provide in order to be able to ask the questions that they that they want to ask, and also to trust that the information that they're getting back isn't designed, or that there isn't information being left out in order to protect the interests of any one particular party. And that trust is really the important thing. We saw that break down with the mayor appointment or nomination. And I think all members could see that person, as a result of that lack of trust, was not going to be able to perform her duties.